Marcus Washington's hands were still black with motor oil when he slid the DNA test across the table at three white people who looked like they'd rather see him dead than rich. And the 99.9% probability staring back at them meant their billionaire father had loved the help more than he'd ever loved them. The attorney's office smelled like furniture polish and old money, the kind of place where even the air felt expensive. Marcus sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent, facing Malcolm Sterling's widow and three legitimate children, and tried not to think about the grease still embedded under his fingernails, despite 20 minutes of scrubbing in the auto shop bathroom. Catherine Sterling had the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled without calculating the social benefit first, pearl necklace tight around her throat like a noose made of respectability. And her eyes went from Marcus's face to his work boots to the oil stain on his jeans he'd missed, cataloging every reason he didn't belong in this room. "This is absurd," she said, her voice carrying the particular cruelty of women who'd spent their lives being told they were better than other people. Malcolm never mentioned any black son. Jonathan Pierce, the attorney who'd called Marcus that morning with news that turned his world inside out, kept his voice professionally neutral. "Mrs. Sterling, the DNA evidence is conclusive. Marcus Washington is Malcolm Sterling's biological son, conceived during your husband's relationship with Ruth Washington in 1982. The name of Marcus's mother in this room, spoken by this white attorney in front of these white people who were looking at him like he was a stain on their family portrait, made something hot and tight coil in Marcus's chest. Ruth Washington had cleaned houses her whole life, her hands cracked and dry from chemicals, her back permanently bent from years of scrubbing other people's floors, and she died 6 years ago without ever telling Marcus his father's name. Now he was sitting in the richest law office in Charleston learning that his mother had worked for these people, had loved their husband and father, and had been paid to disappear. Richard Sterling, the eldest son at 45, looked like his father's ghost, same jaw, same cold blue eyes, same expression that suggested he'd never had to worry about anything except maintaining the empire handed to him. "DNA can be faked," he said. "This is clearly a shakedown. My father was dying, confused, and someone took advantage." "The DNA test was conducted by GeneTech Laboratories 3 months before your father's death," Pierce said, sliding copies of the test results across the mahogany table. "Mr. Sterling was completely lucid when he requested the test and when he modified his will. I have video testimony of his mental competency, witnessed and notarized." Elizabeth Sterling, 42, with her mother's thin lips and her father's calculating eyes, spoke for the first time. "What exactly does the will say?" Her voice shook slightly, and Marcus realized she already knew the answer and was hopping she'd misunderstood. Pierce opened the leather folder in front of him. "Malcolm Sterling's estate is valued at approximately $600 million, including Sterling properties, personal assets, investments, and the family mansion. The will designates Marcus Washington as the primary beneficiary, receiving 60% of the total estate. The remaining 40% is divided among Mrs. Sterling and the 3 children." Silence that followed was the kind that comes right before violence. Catherine's face went the color of her pearls. Richard's hands clenched into fists on the table. Elizabeth closed her eyes like she was praying for this to be a nightmare she could wake from. Only Victoria, the youngest at 38, kept staring at Marcus with an expression he couldn't read, something between horror and curiosity and maybe, impossibly, a flicker of guilt. $360 million, Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're giving $360 million to this." She stopped herself, but Marcus heard the word she didn't say hanging in the air between them like poison gas. "To his son," Pierce finished firmly. "Yes." Marcus hadn't said a word since entering the room. He'd been too busy trying to process the information Pierce had given him in their first meeting yesterday, the manila folder full of his father's journals that Marcus had stayed up all night reading, page after page of Malcolm Sterling's guilt and cowardice, and documented participation in the destruction of black neighborhoods for profit. The inheritance wasn't a gift. It was an apology written in blood money, and Marcus wasn't sure he wanted it. But sitting here, watching these people who'd had everything handed to them look at him like he was stealing what was rightfully theirs, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. They didn't deserve this money. They'd been born into it, grown up in the mansion Malcolm Sterling built on the backs of people like Marcus's mother, and they'd never questioned where it came from or who it hurt. If Marcus walked away, they'd keep doing exactly what their father did, exploiting and displacing and destroying while telling themselves it was just business. "I want to say something," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. All four Sterlings turned to look at him like they'd forgotten he could speak. "My mother, Ruth Washington, worked for your family in 1982. She was 22 years old, and she fell in love with a man who told her he loved her back. When she got pregnant, Malcolm gave her $5,000 and a bus ticket to Atlanta. She raised me alone, worked 3 jobs, and died of breast cancer without ever telling me my father's name because she thought I was better off not knowing him." Catherine started to interrupt, but Marcus kept going, his voice level and calm in a way that made his words hit harder. "I spent last night reading Malcolm's journals, all of them, every entry from 1982 until he died. You want to know what I learned?" Marcus pulled out his own folder, the one he'd brought from home, and opened it to a page he'd marked. "I learned that Sterling Properties has a 40-year history of systematic discrimination, denying housing applications from black families, buying property in minority neighborhoods below value through intimidation, lobbying for zoning changes that destroyed communities. My father," the word still felt foreign in his mouth, documented all of it, his guilt, his complicity, his profits. Richard's face was red now, veins visible on his forehead. "You have no right to—" "I have every right," Marcus said, his voice still quiet but with steel underneath. "Because the neighborhood Sterling Properties destroyed in 1995, the Gadsden Street development that made this company 400% ROI, that's where I grew up. That's where my mother's best friend lost her salon. That's where Mr. Johnson's corner store got bought out for nothing. Malcolm Sterling made his fortune destroying people who looked like me, and then he left that fortune to me because he knew what you'd do with it." Marcus looked at each of them in turn. "You'd keep doing it." "This is blackmail," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking. "You're going to destroy our family's reputation." "Your family's reputation was built on a lie," Marcus said. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm just refusing to keep the secret." Catherine stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We will fight this, every penny. We'll tie you up in court for years. We'll expose you as a fraud and a con artist. By the time we're done, you won't be able to show your face in Charleston." Pierce cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sterling, I should inform you that any legal challenge to the will would require you to contest Mr. Sterling's mental competency, which would necessitate making public the very information you claim to want to protect. The journals, the relationship with Ruth Washington, the business practices Marcus mentioned, all of it would become part of the public record." Threat landed like a bomb. Catherine sank back into her chair, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Richard was already pulling out his phone, probably calling their own attorney. Elizabeth looked like she might cry. Victoria was still staring at Marcus with that unreadable expression. "I didn't come here to fight," Marcus said, and he meant it. "I came here because Pierce told me I had to for the reading of the will. But I want you to know something. That money, I don't need it to be happy. I've got a business I built myself, a community that knows me, and a mother's memory that's worth more than anything your father could leave me. I'm only taking this inheritance for one reason." He stood up, meeting Catherine's hateful glare with calm certainty. "To fix what Malcolm Sterling broke, and if that means going to war with you, then we're going to war." Marcus walked out of that office into the Charleston afternoon where the sun was too bright and the air smelled like salt water and azaleas, and behind him he heard Richard Sterling's voice, loud and vicious, promising to destroy him. Marcus kept walking. He'd survived 42 years without a father's money. He'd survive whatever came next. But first, he needed to figure out if $360 million in blood money could ever be washed clean, or if accepting it made him just another exploiter in a city built on exploitation. His phone was ringing before he reached his truck. "Pierce," Marcus answered. "They've already filed an emergency injunction to freeze the estate," the attorney said. "Judge Whitfield granted a temporary stay. Nothing can be transferred until the competency hearing." "When's the hearing?" 2 weeks. "Marcus, you should know, Judge Whitfield and Malcolm Sterling were college roommates. This isn't going to be a fair fight." Marcus leaned against his truck, the metal warm from the sun, and looked back at the law office where the Sterling family was probably already planning his destruction. "Pierce, I grew up in a city that never wanted me to succeed. I'm used to unfair fights." He drove back to the south side, past the gentrified neighborhoods that used to be black communities. past the luxury condos built where his mother's friend Claudette used to cut hair, past the whole geography of Charleston's racial and economic transformation, and understood for the first time that his inheritance wasn't just money. It was a choice about what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of city Charleston would become. And Marcus Washington, 42 years old, mechanic, son of Ruth Washington who scrubbed floors and loved a man who didn't love her back enough, was about to find out if one black man with a billionaire's guilty conscience could take on a whole system built to keep him in his place. That night, Marcus's shop was broken into, every computer smashed, every file cabinet emptied, and spray-painted across his garage door in 6-foot red letters was a message that made the war official. Go back where you belong, N. The police would call it random vandalism. Marcus knew exactly who sent the message, and he knew the Sterling family's real war had just begun. Dorothy Jenkins, the Sterling family's housekeeper for 40 years, showed up at Marcus's destroyed shop at dawn with a cardboard box that smelled like old perfume and cigarette smoke. And inside were letters his mother wrote, but never sent to the man who abandoned her while she was pregnant with his child. Marcus was sweeping up broken glass when he heard the knock, his shop still reeking of spray paint, the slur on his garage door visible even though he'd tried to scrub it off at 3 in the morning. He'd barely slept, his mind spinning through the violation of someone breaking into his space, destroying his livelihood, making it clear that claiming his inheritance came with a target on his back. When he opened the door, he expected police or maybe Pierce with more bad news. Instead, he found a black woman in her 70s with gray hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing a simple dress and carrying a box like it was made of glass. Ruth's boy, she said, not a question, just recognition. I see her in your eyes. I'm Dorothy. I worked with your mama at the Sterling house in 1982. She held out the box. She asked me to keep these safe, said if anything ever happened to her, if the truth ever came out, I should give them to you. Marcus's hands were shaking when he took the box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were dozens of letters in his mother's handwriting. The first one was dated August 1982, the month she left Charleston. Malcolm, I'm writing this from Atlanta even though I know you'll never read it. Maybe that makes it easier. I can say what I really think without worrying about your comfort or your family or your reputation. I can finally be honest. You told me you loved me. You said it in your kitchen at 2 in the morning when your wife was asleep upstairs and your children were dreaming in their expensive beds. You said it while your hands were on my belly where your baby was growing. You said it like it was true. And I believed you because I wanted to believe that love could exist across all the lines Charleston drew between us. But love that can't survive daylight isn't love, is it? It's cowardice dressed up in pretty words. I'm 22 years old, Malcolm. I'm pregnant with your baby and I'm alone in a city where I don't know anyone because you gave me $5,000 and a one-way ticket away from the life I knew. You called it protecting me, but you weren't protecting me from Charleston's judgment. You were protecting yourself. I want you to know something. I won't tell our child about you. Not because I'm protecting your reputation, because I'm protecting them. I don't want my baby growing up knowing their father chose comfort over courage. I don't want them wondering why they weren't worth fighting for. I don't want them carrying your weakness like it's their inheritance, so I'm going to raise this child alone, and I'm going to teach them that silence is sometimes the kindest lie. But Malcolm, I need you to know that every time I look at our baby's face and see your eyes looking back at me, I'm going to remember that you loved me just enough to sleep with me, but not enough to stand beside me. That's the truth you were too scared to face. I hope your comfortable life was worth it. Ruth Marcus had to stop reading. His vision was blurring and his chest was so tight he could barely breathe. Dorothy was still standing in the doorway, watching him with the patience of someone who'd witnessed decades of secrets and knew the weight they carried. She loved him, Dorothy said softly. Really loved him, not the way Catherine loved him, like he was a prize she'd won. Ruth loved Malcolm like he was a person, and he loved her back, I saw it. But love alone doesn't change the world, baby. Not when the world's built to keep certain people apart. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of motor oil across his cheek. Did you know, the whole time? Did everyone know except me? Dorothy shook her head. Catherine knew, found out when Ruth was 3 months pregnant, made Malcolm choose, his family and fortune or Ruth and the baby. Wasn't really a choice, not for a man like Malcolm Sterling. Catherine's brother was a cop. He followed Ruth to Atlanta, made sure she understood what would happen if she ever came back or tried to contact Malcolm. She was terrified, Marcus, not just for herself, for you. The next letter was dated March 1983, Marcus's birthday. Malcolm, our son, was born today. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. He has your nose and my mouth and eyes that look like they're trying to figure out the whole world at once. I named him Marcus after my grandfather. Strong name for a strong boy. I held him and thought about calling you. I imagined your voice on the phone, imagined you dropping everything and driving to Atlanta to meet your son. Imagined you looking at his face and finding the courage you didn't have 9 months ago, but I didn't call. Because you made your choice and I made mine. My choice is to give Marcus a life where he doesn't have to wonder why his father didn't want him, where he doesn't grow up knowing he was somebody's secret shame. He deserves better than that. He deserves better than us. I hope you're happy in your big house with your legitimate children. I hope it's everything you chose it for. I hope every time you look at their faces, you remember the face you'll never see. Ruth, there were letters for every birthday, every milestone Marcus hit while growing up. First day of school, lost tooth, Little League championship, high school graduation. His mother had written to Malcolm Sterling for years, letters she never sent, pouring out her anger and grief and the daily details of raising their son alone. Each letter was a ghost conversation with a man who'd chosen silence. Marcus read for hours while Dorothy sat quietly in his shop's waiting area, occasionally handing him tissues when the letters got too heavy. He learned things about his mother he'd never known, that she'd tried to go to college but had to drop out when the money ran out, that she'd worked nights at a diner and weekends at a grocery store and still barely made rent, that she'd turned down dates from men who wanted to be a father to Marcus because she couldn't risk anyone finding out who his real father was, that she'd carried Malcolm Sterling's secret like a stone around her neck for 36 years until cancer finally let her put it down. The last letter was dated 2017, a year before Ruth died. Malcolm, I'm dying. The doctors say 6 months, maybe a year if the treatment works. It won't work. I can feel it in my bones the way I could feel you in my bones all those years ago when I still thought love was enough. Marcus is 34 years old now. He's a good man, better than either of us deserved to raise. He owns his own business, works harder than anyone I've ever known, and he's kind. Malcolm, he's so kind it breaks my heart sometimes because I know he learned that from watching me struggle and deciding he never wanted to be the person who caused that kind of pain. I never told him about you. I kept my promise to myself. But I want you to know, if you're reading this somehow, if Dorothy gave you these letters after I'm gone like I asked her to, that you missed something extraordinary. You had a son who would have loved you if you'd given him the chance, who would have forgiven you if you'd asked, who would have understood if you'd tried. But you didn't try. You sent money. Yes, I knew it was you. The amounts were too specific, always matching Marcus's birthday or age. You paid my medical bills. You got him that business loan when the bank rejected him. You helped from a distance like that was the same as being a father. It wasn't. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty. You'll do that yourself if you have any conscience left. I'm writing this because I want you to know that despite everything, despite your cowardice and your choice and the 40 years you spent pretending we didn't exist, I don't regret loving you. Not because you deserved it. Because love isn't about deserving. It's about being human enough to feel it even when it hurts. You taught me that pain and love can occupy the same space. That you can love someone and hate them in the same breath. That silence sometimes speaks louder than words ever could. If you ever find the courage to tell Marcus the truth, tell him this. His mother loved him more than she loved anything in this world, including her pride, her dignity, and the man who gave him life. Tell him he was wanted. Tell him he was enough. Tell him everything I should have told him but couldn't because I was too busy protecting him from you. And Malcolm, I forgive you, not because you asked for it. Because holding on to anger for 40 years is exhausting, and I'm tired, and I want to die without carrying your weight anymore. Goodbye. Ruth. Marcus folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box with the others, his mother's whole hidden life documented in unsent words. Dorothy stood and put a hand on his shoulder. She made me promise not to give you these while she was alive, Dorothy said. Said if you knew while she was still here, you'd spend all your time angry at Malcolm instead of appreciating what you had with her. Ruth was smart like that, knew exactly how to protect you, even from the truth. How did you end up giving them to me now? Marcus asked. My mother's been dead 6 years. Dorothy's face hardened. Because I saw what Catherine did to your shop last night, saw the hate she's still carrying after all these years. Saw her send her nephew and his friends to destroy your business and scare you into walking away from what's rightfully yours. She leaned closer. Ruth kept her silence to protect you, but I'm not Ruth, and you need to know what kind of family you're fighting. Catherine Sterling didn't just know about you, baby. She's known your whole life. She's been watching you, making sure Malcolm never got brave enough to claim you. And now that he's dead and can't be hurt anymore, she's going to try to destroy you instead. Marcus looked at his destroyed shop, at the slur still visible on his garage door, at the box of letters his mother wrote to a ghost. Does Catherine know about these letters? Dorothy shook her head. Ruth only trusted me, but Catherine knows Malcolm kept journals. She's been trying to find them since he died. Pierce has them, Marcus said. My father's journals, I read them all. Malcolm documented everything, the relationship with my mother, the business practices, all of it. Dorothy smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd spent 40 years watching injustice and finally seeing the possibility of balance. Then Catherine Sterling is about to learn that secrets don't die with the people who keep them. They just wait for the right moment to come back and demand payment. Marcus stood, the box of his mother's letters in his hands, and made a decision. He wasn't fighting for Malcolm Sterling's money. He was fighting for Ruth Washington's dignity. For every letter she wrote and never sent. For every year she suffered in silence. For every moment she protected her son from a truth that would have broken him. If Catherine Sterling wanted war, Marcus would give her war. But not for inheritance. For his mother's memory and the 36 years she spent carrying a rich white man's secret so her black son could grow up whole. Marcus was putting his mother's letters in his truck when his phone rang with a Charleston Police Department number. And the detective's voice was cold when he said they'd reviewed the security footage from his shop. And the vandalism appeared to be gang-related. Case closed. And Marcus realized the Sterling family didn't just have money and lawyers. They had the entire city's power structure protecting them from consequences. A competency hearing was assigned to Judge Harrison Whitfield, who'd been Malcolm Sterling's roommate at the Citadel and owed his appointment to the Sterling family's political donations. And Marcus's attorney said 3 words that made the rigged game obvious. We can't win. Jonathan Pierce's office had a view of Charleston Harbor where slave ships once unloaded human cargo, and the irony wasn't lost on Marcus as the attorney explained exactly how the legal system was about to be weaponized against him. Pierce had files spread across his desk, documents showing Judge Whitfield's 40-year relationship with the Sterling family, campaign contributions, social club memberships, a whole network of obligation and favor that meant the hearing was decided before it started. Whitfield will allow the Sterling family's attorneys to challenge Malcolm's mental state, Pierce said, his voice heavy with the resignation of someone who'd practiced law in the South long enough to know which battles couldn't be won in certain courtrooms. They'll bring in psychiatrists who never examined Malcolm to testify about his medications. They'll claim the cancer had spread to his brain, that he was confused and manipulated. They'll paint you as an opportunist who took advantage of a dying man's guilt. Even with the DNA evidence? Marcus asked. Even with my father's journals documenting everything? Pierce nodded. The DNA proves you're Malcolm's biological son. It doesn't prove he was mentally competent when he changed the will. And the journals, Richard Sterling's attorneys will argue those show evidence of depression and instability, not clarity. Every word Malcolm wrote about guilt and regret becomes ammunition for their case that he wasn't thinking rationally. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor where his ancestors had been bought and sold, and felt the weight of history pressing down like a physical thing. So what are my options? Settle. They've authorized me to offer you $10 million to walk away quietly. You sign an NDA, agree never to use the Sterling name, and they'll release a statement saying the DNA test was inconclusive. $10 million, more money than Marcus could imagine. Enough to rebuild his shop, expand his business, live comfortably for the rest of his life without ever worrying about bills or car payments or whether he could afford to take a day off. His mother had worked herself to death for a fraction of that amount, and the Sterling family was offering it to him like it was nothing, like it was the cost of making a problem disappear. And if I don't settle? Pierce hesitated. Then we go to trial knowing the judge is compromised, knowing the jury will be selected from a pool of Charleston residents who have been reading newspaper articles about you that the Sterling family's PR team has been planting all week. They've already started the narrative. You're a con artist who found out about Malcolm's cancer and manipulated a dying man. They've got character witnesses lined up to testify that Malcolm never mentioned you, that he was confused in his final months, that the will changes were out of character. They're lying. Doesn't matter if we can't prove it in Whitfield's courtroom. And Marcus, you need to understand what you're walking into. This isn't just about money. The Sterling family has been part of Charleston's power structure since before the Civil War. They have relationships with every judge, every politician, every business owner who matters. If you fight this and lose, they'll make sure you're destroyed. Your business, your reputation, your ability to work in this city, all of it gone. Marcus turned from the window. You think I should take the settlement? Pierce met his eyes. I think you should make an informed decision knowing that the system is designed to protect people like the Sterlings and punish people like you for trying to claim what's legally yours. I think you should know that being right doesn't mean you'll win, and I think you should consider whether fighting for your father's money is worth losing everything your mother built for you. The words landed like a slap because they were true. Ruth Washington had raised Marcus to survive in a world that didn't want him to succeed. She taught him to keep his head down, work hard, build something small but solid that couldn't be taken away. Taking the settlement would honor her memory. Fighting would risk everything. But Marcus thought about his mother's letters, all those years of silence and suffering. He thought about Malcolm Sterling's journals, page after page of documented exploitation and discrimination. He thought about the Gadsden Street neighborhood that used to exist before Sterling Properties demolished it for profit. And he thought about what message it would send if he accepted $10 million to stay quiet about a billionaire's secret black son and the fortune built on destroying black communities. Up a meeting with Judge Whitfield, Marcus said. Pierce frowned. That's highly irregular ex parte communication with the judge before the hearing. Not asking you to come. I'll request the meeting myself, as a concerned citizen who wants to understand the judicial process. Marcus pulled out his phone. What's the courthouse address? Marcus, this is a mistake. Whitfield will. I know exactly what he'll do. That's why I need to see him face to face. Days later, Marcus sat in Judge Harrison Whitfield's chambers, a room that smelled like old books and furniture polish, and felt like it hadn't been updated since Reconstruction. Whitfield was 73 years old, white hair, expensive suit, the kind of Southern gentleman who probably still believed the Civil War was about states' rights. He'd agreed to the meeting out of curiosity, Marcus suspected, wanting to see up close the black man who thought he could claim a sterling fortune. Mr. Washington, Whitfield said, his accent thick with generations of Charleston aristocracy. I understand you wanted to discuss the upcoming competency hearing. You should know I can't speak about the case itself. That would be improper. I don't want to talk about the case, Marcus said. I want to talk about my father. Whitfield's expression flickered just for a moment, something that might have been guilt or memory or both. Malcolm and I were close once, long time ago. Close enough that he told you about me? The silence that followed was answer enough. Whitfield stood and walked to his window, looking out at the courthouse square where Confederate monuments still stood despite years of protests. Malcolm mentioned a situation in 1982. He was conflicted, said he'd made a mistake with someone on his staff. I advised him to protect his family, his reputation. I told him that a man in his position couldn't afford certain indiscretions becoming public. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. You knew I existed. You knew my father had a black son he abandoned, and you're the judge assigned to decide whether he was competent when he tried to make it right. Whitfield turned, his face unreadable. I'm a fair judge, Mr. Washington. My personal relationship with Malcolm doesn't you owe your career to the Sterling family, Marcus interrupted. Catherine Sterling's father got you your first appointment. Malcolm contributed to every campaign you ran. The Sterlings paid for your daughter's wedding at their country club. Don't tell me you're fair when we both know this hearing is already decided. Whitfield's jaw tightened. You're out of line. I'm out of options, Marcus said. So I'm going to tell you something my mother taught me. She said that silence is how injustice stays comfortable, that powerful people count on the rest of us being too scared or too tired to speak truth. She spent 40 years silent about who my father was because she thought it would protect me, but her silence just protected him. Marcus stood, meeting the judge's eyes with the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. Going to rule against me, I know that. You're going to let the Sterling family keep their money and their reputation and their power. But I want you to know that when you do, you're not just ruling on a will dispute. You're ruling that a black woman who was paid to disappear and a black son who was denied his father his whole life don't deserve the same justice as the white family who benefited from that denial. You're ruling that Malcolm Sterling's lifetime of documented racism and exploitation should be rewarded with silence and protection. That's not what... That's exactly what this is, Marcus said. And I want you to carry that knowledge. I want you to think about it every time you put on that robe and pretend the law is blind. Because it's not blind, Judge. It just looks away from things that would make powerful people uncomfortable. Marcus walked to the door, then turned back. My father left me his journals, 40 years of documentation about his business practices, his relationship with my mother, his guilt about who he was and what he'd built. When you rule against me, all of that becomes public record. Every newspaper in the country will cover this story. Malcolm Sterling's secret black son, the billionaire's guilty conscience, the Charleston judge who protected the family that owned him. Is that the legacy you want? Whitfield's face had gone pale. Are you threatening me? Telling you the truth, Marcus said. Same truth my mother never got to tell. Same truth Malcolm Sterling spent 40 years running from. The only question is whether you're brave enough to hear it. Marcus left the courthouse and drove through Charleston's historic district, where plaques celebrated Confederate generals and plantation owners, where the wealth of slavery was preserved in museums and mansion tour, where history was carefully curated to make oppression look like heritage. His phone was ringing constantly, Pierce calling to say the Sterling family had increased their settlement offer to $15 million, then 20, their desperation growing as they realized Marcus wasn't going to be bought off or scared away. That night, Marcus received a visitor at his apartment. Victoria Sterling, the youngest of Malcolm's legitimate children, stood in his doorway looking nothing like the composed woman from the law office. Her eyes were red, her makeup smudged, and she was holding a file folder. My mother doesn't know I'm here, she said. Can I come in? Marcus hesitated, then stepped aside. Victoria entered his small apartment, looking around at the modest furniture and worn carpet with the expression of someone seeing how the other half lived for the first time. Why are you here? Marcus asked. Victoria sat down uninvited, setting the folder on his coffee table. Because my father was a coward and a hypocrite, and I'm tired of protecting his lies. She opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, property records, internal company memos. This is documentation of every discriminatory practice Sterling Properties engaged in from 1980 to 2020. Systematic denial of loans to black applicants, predatory buying in minority neighborhoods, lobbying for zoning changes that displaced thousands of families. My father built our fortune by destroying communities like the one you came from. Marcus stared at the documents. Why are you giving me this? Victoria's voice broke. Because I grew up watching my father be one person in public and someone else in private. I watched him give speeches about community development while signing contracts that demolished black neighborhoods. I watched my mother cultivate this image of Charleston aristocracy while treating anyone who wasn't white and wealthy like they were invisible. And I convinced myself it was just business, just the way things worked. She looked at Marcus with tears streaming down her face. Then I read his journals. Pierce gave my mother copies to review for the case. I read about Ruth, about you, about his guilt, and I realized my entire life was built on a lie that destroyed yours. You're here out of guilt. Here because someone in my family should do the right thing, Victoria said. I can testify at the hearing. I can confirm that my father was completely lucid, that he talked about you, that he wanted to make things right. I can provide this evidence to support your case. But, she hesitated, if I do this, my family will disown me. My mother will never speak to me again. Richard and Elizabeth will cut me off completely. I'll lose my inheritance, my trust fund, my place in Charleston society, everything I've known my whole life. Marcus looked at this white woman sitting in his apartment, offering to destroy her comfortable life to help him fight for justice, and felt the complexity of the moment settle heavy on his shoulders. Why would you do that? Because I have children, Victoria said simply. And I don't want them growing up thinking that silence and complicity are the same as innocence. I don't want them to be 40 years old before they realize their comfort came at someone else's suffering. She stood. You don't have to decide now. But when the hearing happens, if you need me to testify, I will, whatever it costs. She left the folder and walked out, leaving Marcus alone with evidence that could change everything, and the realization that maybe, impossibly, not everyone in the Sterling family was beyond redemption. Marcus was reviewing Victoria's documents when his window shattered, glass exploding across his living room, and the brick that came through it had a note tied with string that said, Drop the case or your shop isn't the only thing we burn. And Marcus understood that the Sterling family's next attack wouldn't be legal, it would be lethal. This story ends with Marcus winning the inheritance. But you and I both know the Sterling family isn't done. Catherine's plotting, Richard's making calls. And somewhere in Charleston, someone's planning the next attack. Part 2 of this story drops next week, and it involves a fire, a murder accusation, and evidence that Malcolm Sterling wasn't the only billionaire hiding a secret black family. If you thought this was just about one man's inheritance, you weren't paying attention. This is about burning down a system, and the system always fights back.